Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast, I'm going to be reading from an essay I wrote called Between the Sinner and the Saint, and it is taken from Jung and A Course in Miracles. There's also a version of it in my other book called Alchemists of Suburbia. I wrote this essay shortly after reading a book called Just Kids by Patti Smith, the punk rock singer and poet. The book is a beautiful reflection on her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, the photographer that was famous for his controversial black and white photographs of that era as well. At the time of reading Just Kids, I was also becoming familiar with the philosopher George Hegel and his philosophy of history and the opposites trying to work themselves out. Now, as you may know, in A Course in Miracles, the opposites that are always mentioned are the opposites of victim and victimizer. We also have the opposites of one or the other, the winner or the loser, and the whole idea of separate interests, that our interests are separate from somebody else's. So the idea of opposition is very much a part of the ego thought system and something that A Course in Miracles aims to help us correct, so that we come to an experience or an understanding of shared interests. Well, I thought that Robert Mapplethorpe's life and career provided a very clear example of what happens when we adopt an extreme position and how that position often relates to a repressed trauma. Now, rather than working out or loosening up that very extreme position, we tend to double down on it. Here's a wonderful quote that reflects that. It's from John Kenneth Galbraith. He says, "Faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving that there is no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy on the proof." And in terms of A Course in Miracles, we could say that proof that we get busy on to double down on our extreme stance is that we have been hard done by, that we have been hurt, that we have been victimised. That's unconsciously what's going on. And so the idea of victim and victimizer plays out in many different ways in the world. And that's also what this essay will look into. So without further ado, let's get into the essay. It's called Between the Sinner and the Saint. And don't get put off by the subtitle. It's called Hegel's Dialectic and its relationship to healing. A big subtitle, but as you'll see, it's not hard to understand or relate to once we get into it. Between the Sinner and the Saint, Part 1. Robert Mapplethorpe is best known for his powerful black and white photographs of flowers in full bloom and of New York's underground gay BDSM scene, which means bondage and sadomasochism. While most people can handle the flowers, many are shocked by the sexually explicit material, and close-up studies of male genitalia often hung right beside them. What on earth was Mapplethorpe up to, is a question often posed. To Mapplethorpe, the flowers and the sexual imagery embodied the same pornographic aesthetic. Both subjects were photographed to express an intense eroticism. His cleverness, and perhaps something that adds to the viewer's disorientation, is that he presents his subjects in a way that reflects the symmetry, composition, and seriousness of classical art and sculpture. Technically, Mapplethorpe's photos are brilliant. Subject-wise, they remain controversial. The, quote, shy pornographer, as he was once addressed by his long-term partner, is also well known for his portraits of famous people, high-profile artists, writers, actors, and musicians all assume a place in his portfolio. Mapplethorpe also created a number of self-portraits that reflected a self as dark entity theme. In these, he is clad in a black leather jacket, his hair slicked up into a quiff, a flip knife in hand or a cigarette loosely balanced to one side of his mouth. A bad boy of the 50s image. In one photo, he looks like a naked satyr. Horns protrude from his head, perhaps in a reference to the Greek god Dionysus, the god of wine, sensuality, wild abandon, and chaos. In another, he stands holding an automatic rifle in front of an inverted five-pointed star, a classic symbol of the devil. Maplethorpe liked to identify with the devil because of his self-described sinful behaviour. I can imagine him as Caravaggio's Bacchus, a bare-chested youth with grapes and vine leaves artistically arranged in his hair, holding a glass of wine as he lounges with a gaze that is the antithesis of uptight. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche also had a soft spot for Bacchus, which is the other name for Dionysus. So important were Dionysian qualities to Nietzsche's concept of personal evolution and growth that during his psychological breakdown, his identification with the god went into overdrive. Nietzsche wrote a series of letters to friends and royal figures, focusing on the importance of hedonism, sometimes calling for the death of the Pope, and signing off as Dionysus. Both Maplethorpe and Nietzsche had a strict Christian upbringing. Nietzsche's dad was a pastor, and at elementary school, the young Nietzsche was nicknamed the Little Pastor for his knowledge of the Bible and his piety. Maplethorpe was one of 6 children born to a devout Catholic couple and was brought up in a strict Catholic environment. It's hard not to see the two artists' identification with Dionysus, the sensual, the passionate, the wild, as a reaction against their upbringing. They swung from one pole to another. The 18th century German philosopher George Hegel was particularly interested in this kind of compensation, this swinging from one extreme to another. He saw it in people, but he also saw it in social movements and in the progression of history. To Hegel, the pendulum swing wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but rather a means to a higher end. Subtitle: Hegel's Dialectic. In his Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, Hegel observes that historical progress isn't linear, but is more a series of lurches forward and back between opposite poles. A state of tyranny, for example, generates a need for freedom, but once freedom is achieved, anarchy takes over until an element of control is synthesised with freedom, creating a lawful but not oppressive state of affairs. Hegel described this dynamic, a movement from one opposite to another until a synthesis occurs, dialectical. Specifically, a dialectic is a philosophical term for an argument consisting of a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. Both a thesis and antithesis contain parts of the truth, but are gross distortions of the whole. They are exaggerated, unbalanced, and as such are detrimental in particular ways. The pair of opposites interact until they find resolution in a synthesis, whereby the helpful aspects of each become expressed. Here, the whole is certainly greater than and different to the sum of the parts. And so, the world makes progress by lurching from one extreme to another, as each movement seeks to compensate for a previous mistake. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, for example, was a period in European history which grew out of the 17th century's scientific revolution and which elevated the value of human reason. The world could be understood through a rational process, and this meant an end to a focus on mystery, intuition, the authority of the church, and its emphasis on supernatural beliefs. The Romantic era followed as a reaction against the Enlightenment, stressing the importance of feeling and the irrational in human life. A sense of respect for what can't be measured or contained came back onto the scene, though it led to a degree of wildness and excess in the name of free expression. As these two camps wrestled with each other, a kind of science versus the arts situation, a middle stance emerged that recognised our need to appreciate both reason and emotion, deduction and poetry. Likewise, we can all achieve a greater sense of inner unity through a dialectic. You could say we reach a greater appreciation for our wholeness via the exploration of opposing aspects, first divided out and clearly seen, then integrated in a way that expresses their helpful aspects. For Hegel, such a synthesis, within ourselves or in the greater social field of history, wasn't just about working things out on the worldly plane. Hegel was also a student of theology and created a metaphysical explanation for what he observed, giving his dialectic a much grander function than simply achieving a happy medium. So now I'm going to talk about Hegel's metaphysics, and then I will get into the course's metaphysics and how it differs. But again, sometimes when you can compare the course's theory and metaphysics with what came before it, you get a better appreciation for the course. So let's begin. Hegel's metaphysics of polarity. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes the historical dialectic as the byproduct of an all-encompassing mind or spirit that is coming to understand itself. In the beginning, according to Hegel, there was an abstract unity consisting of spirit or mind, what he calls Geist. Although this was a unity, it was in its infancy, not knowing itself as well as it could, not quite all it could be. To reach a higher unity, spirit underwent a series of divisions into separate functions, and thus was born a universe of opposites, spirit and matter, light and dark, freedom and restraint, inner and outer. The list goes on. The most important dialectic in Hegel's metaphysics is that between master and slave. The master is a particular consciousness that's in conflict with its antithetical consciousness, the slave. The master wants to dominate, the slave wants to be free, and so there is an ongoing struggle between the two. A synthesis occurs when both the master and slave realise their interdependence, and this happens when they realise their inherent equality. After all, the master is also a slave of sorts because they depend on the slave's labour. Basically, when master and slave see their common humanity, this is a step forward in matter being reunited with spirit and towards spirit understanding itself. This realisation also brings with it a true sense of freedom, of independence through interdependence. If we are all united in spirit or mind, then my dependence on you is my dependence on me. As Hegel put it, the synthesis in the master-slave dialectic involves a realisation of, quote, the I that is we and the we that is I, end of quote. Hegel's philosophy is known as idealism because he believed that the master-slave dynamic would work itself out through time until there would no longer be any masters or slaves, and eventually no world or universe, just spirit as a higher form of abstract unity. In Hegel's metaphysics, the creation of a world of opposites out of a primordial unity happens so that the absolute can realise itself better. The metaphysics of A Course in Miracles also contains a creation myth based on splits and division. However, the course differs significantly as to cause and purpose of the splits and the division, and this leads to a different idea of what synthesis means and how it can come about. So, just some reflections on what I've just read. It seems clear to me that Hegel appreciated that the polarity within society between master and slave, those who have power, those who don't, those who have more freedom and those who don't, the masters and the slaves, that polarity was problematic if it remained, that progress involved some kind of resolution in which there were no oppressors and the oppressed. And he saw history working out so that we gain more and more equality of freedom through some kind of mutual appreciation. But he did feel that it was something primarily that is worked out there in the world, in society, through history, not as an internal focus, which is why the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had a lot of problems with Hegel. He didn't like Hegel. He didn't like his system. his system related to the metaphysics and how history works out. He didn't like that systemic approach. He liked to focus on the experience of the individual and the individual's mind and the individual working out the opposites within. Anyway, that's just a bit of a side, but if you do look back in history to philosophers and psychologists, you will find a lot of them reflecting on the nature of opposites within and without, and how to come to some kind of resolution of the opposition between them. You'll find it in Hegel. You'll find it in a lot of the German idealist philosophers. You'll find it in Søren Kierkegaard, who I love, and you'll find it in Carl Jung. You'll find it in Eastern philosophies. So the Course is certainly not alone in discussing how to resolve the problem of opposites in terms of victimizer and victim. The Course is certainly different in that it emphasises that it's our perceptions of being a victim and it's our perceptions of being a victimizer. It's our interpretations that are the thing to be addressed rather than the form of what goes on in our life. So back to the essay, and we'll come into now the Course's metaphysics with this subtitle, A Tiny Mad Idea. In the Course's creation myth, the world is the result of a mistaken belief that we could separate ourselves from oneness. The myth begins with an abstract unity, God as love, knowledge, oneness. At some point, it appeared as if a part of God's oneness pondered on the possibility of being a separate entity and what it might be like to have a will of its own. And with this thought, the imagined situation seemed to become a reality. This part of God's oneness now perceived itself as separate from the all and opposed to it. This separated aspect then had two thoughts, or heard two voices, one that said that it had indeed separated from God, and one that said nothing had happened, because it couldn't happen. The former was the voice of what the Course calls the ego, the latter the voice of the Holy Spirit, our memory of unity. According to the Course, all of us who believe we are here, and that's all of us, listened to the ego, but then felt guilty for having destroyed God's oneness and became fearful of punishment. Having believed the ego, we forgot all about the Holy Spirit's voice. We therefore didn't turn to the Holy Spirit for help with our fear, but instead tried to get rid of it, our fear, by projecting the imagined conflict with God out onto a world governed by opposites of all kinds, eternally at war with each other. And regardless of how things look to observers in terms of who is a victim and who is a victimizer, who is a master and who is a slave, all of us will identify as the victim at some level. Look what you made me do, is the cry of many people observed abusing others. The drive to identify as the victim is the drive to keep our guilt at bay. In the metaphysics of the Course, division is the result of repression. The tiny mad idea that we could separate ourselves from oneness leads to guilt and fear of punishment. We then repress our guilt and project out a world of opposites in which to hide, identifying as a victim impinged upon by people and circumstances. And we find victimizers everywhere, in every way, shape and form. The ego's voice teaches us that our peace is held to ransom by things outside of our mind, outside our agency. This is what makes us feel victim to the stock market, the boss, our partner, our parents, children, or the food we just ate. Victims and victimizers. This thesis and antithesis are the Course's equivalent of Hegel's master and slave dynamic, the hammer and the anvil, the winner and the loser, the self-effacing compliant type, and the domineering defiant type. There are so many ways you could put it, but it's the one dynamic that relentlessly makes the world go round. In Hegel's terms, we might say it is the engine of history. If we look at any extreme, the defiant sinner or the self-effacing saint, there's a repression behind it related to our separation from God, which means there's a call for healing. Synthesis, then, in the Course's system, is a matter of forgiveness, and this will be explored in part 2 of this post. Okay, so that's the end of part 1, and I just want to go back to when I said Hegel would say that it's the engine of history. What I mean by that is the engine of history, meaning what makes historical events occur. So what makes a big event in history? And it's, in Hegel's mind, it's always something to do with working out that master-slave dialectic. And so in the Course's terms, we could say that it's something to do with working out that victim-victimizer dynamic. All the dramatic stuff of the world, or the engine of history, comes from conflicts around victim and victimizer, or to be more accurate, perceptions of victim and victimizer. So now we come to part 2, where we're going to begin with a bit of a distinction between repression and dissociation, between repressing something out of awareness and between splitting it off, which is what dissociation means. Okay, between the sinner and the saint, part 2. The Course's metaphysics are in line with psychological theory. Behind a dissociation, or split into opposites, is repression of an issue, an inner conflict related to incidental or developmental trauma. It's like a train travelling along a track until it reaches a point, a trauma, where the track suddenly splits in two. The train itself then splits in two, so that half goes down one track, which is the conscious, expressed aspect of the personality, and the other half goes down the other track, representing its unconscious polar opposite. So what we're saying here is that something happens, it's a shock to the system. Let's say we are adventurous and we do something adventurous or take a risk and it ends very badly, traumatically for us. We then might dissociate or split off. Well, first of all, we might repress that memory of the trauma. Secondly, we split off or dissociate the part of our personality that is adventurous, that is light-hearted, that is spontaneous. And now that goes into our unconscious. It becomes, in Jung terms, part of our shadow. And consciously, purposefully, we adopt the cautious part of ourself. That is the one we now begin and end our days with, consciously now seeing ourselves as a cautious individual, and pretty soon everybody else will see us that way too. Okay, carrying on. We adopt the conscious track in order to feel safe. For example, if we were belittled, made to feel inferior, ignored, or mocked for our sensitivity, we might adopt a tough guy suit of armour, leaving our feminine, inverted commas, side to coast down the unconscious track. Conversely, if we're treated in a way that leads us to fear authority figures and being bad, or if we suffer a trauma that makes us afraid of our spontaneity and self-expression, we can develop a compliant, submissive attitude. As a result, anything resembling self-care and assertiveness heads down the unconscious track. So this is where we start to no longer be a friend to ourselves. We can't assert ourselves kindly, and I'm not talking about being a bully, but we can't assert ourselves when we need to and when it would be kind to ourselves and to others to do so, or we can't let ourselves get in touch with our softer side, if you like, inverted commas, and let ourselves be embraced by others when that would be very kind to ourselves and to others as well. So when we adopt an extreme, we just can't be the kind person, the supportive person to ourselves that we need to be or that we could be. We are literally at odds with a part of ourselves and therefore at odds with ourselves. Subtitle: Repression, splitting, and the original trauma. In the Course's myth, there are two reasons we experienced God as an unloving father. Firstly, we wanted him to give us special attention, but he couldn't, because specialness of any kind goes against the very constitution of oneness. Secondly, we resented the fact that God created us. We wanted to have the power of first cause. We wanted to be number one in terms of power and attention. We wanted to feel adored above all else, to be king of the mountain. These issues with God are translated into our earthly experience through our first relationships with authority figures, which are our parents or primary carers. Wanting to be adored above all else translates into sibling rivalry. Resenting the power of your parents relates to the authority problem. The first scenario involves a fear of abandonment and rejection, or shame anxiety. The second, a fear of punishment, or guilt anxiety. Sigmund Freud is known for his emphasis on repression, how it develops in regard to our relationships with parents, and how it plays out in our lives, particularly in psychosomatic complaints. Carl Jung is better known for an emphasis on splitting and dissociation, on the two tracks that develop out of the repression. Perhaps the clearest indication of how these two approaches relate to healing is seen in their theories around dream interpretation. Freud looks at dreams as a way of fulfilling a wish that we can't fulfill in our daily life, and this wish will also express something edible in nature. We want to possess the affection of someone we shouldn't, and or take a rival down a peg or two. We want to seduce or we want to destroy. That's about the sum and substance of our wishes, according to Freud. Jung takes another approach to interpreting dreams. He sees them as compensation rather than a means for wish fulfillment. To Jung, our dreams compensate for our conscious attitude by showing us the qualities we have dissociated and that are calling for integration. The qualities we have repressed are given a voice in our dreams. Freud and Jung also differ on why dreams tend to be so bizarre. Freud explains the weirdness of dreams, such as they don't obey the laws of space and time, they can be full of contradictions, they can jump from a beginning straight to an end. He explains all of this as stemming from a mental censor that guards our sleep. By expressing our unacceptable wishes in a disguised form, the dream protects the sleeping ego. So, in other words, this censor makes everything a bit strange and a bit unrealistic so as to disguise the unacceptable wishes. That is why Freud talked about a dream's manifest content, meaning the actual content of the dream, the actual what's going on, and its latent content, meaning the hidden meaning behind the dream. In contrast, Jung sees the symbology of dreams as a way of expressing the compensatory attitude that is trying to emerge. The weirdness of dream imagery, according to Jung, is the result of its emergence from a level of the mind where meaning is created through metaphor and symbol. There is, says Jung, no attempt to disguise anything in a dream. Jung gives the example of a female patient's dream in which someone gave her a richly ornamented, antique Celtic sword. In analysis, she associated the sword with a dagger that belonged to her father. In writing about this dream, Jung suggests Freud would say the dagger represented the patient's wish for her father's, quote, weapon. In other words, the interpretation would have a sexual slant, representing the daughter's wish to possess her father sexually. That's according to Freud. Jung puts forward his own view. The sword represents the patient's need to express the wholeness of her personality. It is a compensation for her own passive and dependent attitude via a symbolic image of passion, energy, and will. And here I'm going to follow on with some of my own thoughts about the dream. We could, however, also see the sword as related to the patient's father, in that it represents his Celtic ancestry and powerful position in the family. The important point is that the object is a sword, not a dagger. and though related to the father, represents something stately and warrior-like. This is in contrast to a dagger, with its more underhanded, sinister, possibly murderous connotations. The sword, therefore, could indicate the patient was ready and willing to embody the healthy, majestic aspects of will and self-assertion, which is not the same as a desire for dominance and control over others. It is distinct from a kill or be killed mentality, which perhaps had been evident in her father. The difference in Freud and Jung's theories on the function of dreams is also reflected in their views of artistic creativity, which is highly symbolic by nature. Art, according to Freud, is a way for the artist to sublimate their sexual drives and seek for fame, money, and the love of a woman, in his words. Jung has a very different view of artistic creativity. Art can be seen as a way of representing something that is in the process of becoming known. The work of David Bowie provides a clear example of the Jungian view of creativity. Early in his career, Bowie wrote and performed music under the guise of several alter egos. Ziggy Stardust was Bowie's first major stage character and made his debut with the 1972 album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. Ziggy was an androgynous alien rock star sent to Earth to save the world from the apocalypse. In true rock star form, however, he ends up being more interested in seduction, taking up the mantle of lover rather than fighter. After touring the album in the US, Bowie was ready for a change in character. Aladdin Sane was born as the alter ego of Ziggy, a dark and sinister character, followed by the equally dark Thin White Duke, who became known for his extreme right-wing sympathies. After this time as the Thin White Duke, Bowie started to embrace his uncurated self as a performer, and the stage personas went by the wayside. In interviews, he describes being unprepared to perform on stage as himself until he'd explored these various characters. Moreover, his exploration wasn't limited to writing music and creating costumes. For instance, when Bowie was working on a song, he'd often use painting as a way to move forward when he felt blocked or unsure of how to proceed. His combined artistic endeavours were clearly a way of giving form to something he was processing within himself. A painting, they say, is always a self-portrait, and Jung would agree. This is perhaps why many artists would still do what they do, even if there wasn't any financial reward. They do it because they have to. It's their means of integration, of achieving a synthesis between the thesis and antithesis playing out internally. This is why I suspect we gain so much pleasure from some works of art. There is something in them that we recognise within ourselves, our own process of coming to terms with our contradictions, along with the promise of the ever-present whole. In a video called How to Listen to Music, Daniel Barenboim, the great contemporary conductor and pianist, said that people find solace in sad music, not because it makes them sadder, but because great music contains all emotions. It can be sad, yet contain happiness at the same time. It expresses one aspect whilst connecting with the whole. So now we're going to get back to discussing Robert Mapplethorpe, who we began the essay with, and this idea of antithesis, thesis, and synthesis. So the subtitle is Synthesis. If Robert Mapplethorpe's fascination with the satanic, the sinful, and the darkly erotic was at all a reaction to his upbringing, I wonder how his art might have evolved if he'd had long enough, beyond his 42 years, to work through his conflicts with his father, Harry. As illustrated in reporter Kim Masters' interview with Harry 1 year after Robert's death, Harry was never able to accept his son's sexuality or bohemian lifestyle, and he was resentful that Robert didn't provide for him at all in his will, donating much of his wealth to the Getty Museum and programs for artists and AIDS research. In so many ways, Robert fell far from the tree. Harry Mapplethorpe was a staunch conservative who had never and would never vote Democrat. In his retirement, he ushered at Mass every Sunday and maintained his membership with the National Rifle Association, storing his collection of rifles in Robert's old bedroom. I think that might be symbolic itself. An engineer, Harry had wanted his sons to follow suit and was discouraging of Robert's interest in art as a career. Get a 9-to-5 job, get married, have children. That was Harry's way. After Robert moved out of home in his late teens and headed for New York to pursue a career as an artist, he returned to the quiet, middle-of-the-road suburb of his parents, wearing black leather and accompanied by punk rocker and poet Patti Smith, his similarly bohemian partner. Harry wasn't impressed, and this is what he said to the interviewer. The way she used to dress and the way he used to dress, I used to think, how have they got the nerve to come here like that? This is a quiet neighbourhood. I used to get so aggravated. I'd probably pass some remarks about his dress and things of that sort. Not only did Harry not approve of Robert's lifestyle, he thought his pursuits were unmanly. When asked by Masters whether he would consider going to a Patti Smith concert, Harry replied scornfully, "That's not for men. The rock scene, the art scene, the bohemian life, none of it was the natural, inverted commas, preoccupation for real men. At least, that was Harry's stance." The disdain for Robert's lifestyle and career choice, along with rejection of his sexuality, might have created a cocktail of shame for Robert, who exhibited a level of self-destructiveness in his cavalier attitude towards the risks of contracting HIV. For many people whose identity is significantly linked with shame, a bring-it-on attitude towards physical danger and their own demise is common. Robert remained absent from his family for years after his initial return, keeping a distance and focusing on his work. Even when his brother Richard died, he didn't attend the funeral. It wasn't until 1987, when Robert's parents found out he was dying of AIDS, that they first visited his studio loft in Manhattan. Harry was impressed by his son's collection of fine art and the opulent surrounds, yet quietly resented that the life his son had led contributed to his illness. But the subject of Robert's lifestyle was never broached. They talked about his art collection instead. Robert had kept away from his family because he knew his father, and perhaps his mother, wouldn't be able to accept his sexuality and his work. Yet I wonder how much this effort to keep separate fueled his obsession with dark places. Was it, in some way, an attempt through defiance to feel strong? The leather-clad self-portraits, a form of subterfuge for a sensitive, vulnerable, hurt individual? Was the sexually explicit material an attack on the sensibilities of a father more concerned with the opinions of his quiet neighbourhood than making his son feel welcome? In Hegel's Dialectic, the swinging between opposite poles of historical movements occurs over centuries until some kind of synthesis is reached. In other words, it takes a very long time to attain a happy medium. Things lurch one way, then the other, until we understand how to make them work for the better. On an individual level, in matters related to our own psychological experience, it might take decades, a generation, or lifetimes before we work things out this way. There simply aren't enough hours in the day or years in a lifetime to get the job done. If only there was another way. And if you are familiar with A Course in Miracles, you'll recognise that that's where I'm about to head right now with that last line, if only there was another way, because famously the course came about or was initiated after Bill Thetford said to Helen Schuckman, there must be another way of relating to people in the world and in particular to their colleagues at work that didn't involve so much conflict. So here we are about to get back into the Course in Miracles with subtitle Forgiveness, Saving Thousands of Years. Returning to the psychological idea, also expressed in the Course's myth, that repression precedes splitting and the adoption of an extreme position, it follows that working through the repression will help us come to a more balanced position, a synthesis of the harmonious aspects of the poles. In Jungian terminology, and more in line with the Course, it's not so much a matter of synthesis, but of transcending opposites and naturally embodying the best of all aspects. For example, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung says the following about the polarity between thinking and feeling. Wisdom is never violent. Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. End of quote. You could say that alongside every major forgiveness issue stands the adoption of an extreme, and extremes are never gentle. The process of addressing a significant grievance is often initiated through some kind of calamity or challenge to our habitual way of doing things. This is the stuff of myths and movies. For example, a career-obsessed parent who has no time for their child nearly loses them in an accident. Then, after days by their child's bedside in hospital, they come to see how important they are to them. The child recovers, the achievement-oriented parent is born anew, more balanced and caring. It sounds cliché, but it resonates with us time and time again because on some level we know this kind of transformation touches on something essential to our own being. An extreme character, in one respect or another, experiences a calamity which necessitates self-reflection and growth, and a more balanced character is born. In my book, Above the Battleground, The Courageous Path to Emotional Autonomy and Inner Peace, I describe how Patty Schemmel, the drummer for punk rock band Hole, went through such a transformation after a humiliating experience in the recording studio, in which her musicianship, her value, was questioned. She had been sober for months, but after leaving the studio, feeling humiliated, betrayed, confused, and professionally uncertain, she reached for comfort in drugs. She left the band and rented a room where no one, including her family, could find her. Subsequently, Schemmel's drug and alcohol use went to a level it hadn't gone to before. She became addicted to heroin and crack. She became homeless, turning to theft, prostitution, and selling drugs to feed her habit. Not only was the addiction a means of numbing her emotional pain, Schemmel's self-destructive behaviour was a self-confessed, "screw you guys," towards everyone who had let her down. In her demise, she pointed an accusing finger at all who had abandoned and mistreated her in her near present and distant past. There was, moreover, a strong element of self-pity in her self-destructiveness, along with the tacit agreement of the lowly opinion she believed others had of her. Growing up in the 70s, Schemmel had been teased for her red hair and glasses, and she knew that her sexuality strayed from the norm. She got the message from the wider culture that she should be ashamed of herself and began to feel lonely and stupid in public. The incident in the studio brought all of Schemmel's childhood humiliations home, and they hit her with an almighty thud. Indeed, her autobiography is titled "Hit So Hard." While she finally decided she'd had enough of street life, Schemmel phoned her father, then stayed with him while she joined a rehabilitation program which addressed her past, her self-concept, and her addictions. And while drumming had once been Schemmel's way of channeling her aggression and feeling powerful, it became a means of assisting her recovery. She became a drumming teacher for children and teens. Schemmel's experience expresses something of the nature of synthesis. When we're no longer stuck in an extreme, either self-destruction or self-elevation, for example, we express what is both helpful to ourselves and to others. We express something akin to Hegel's "the I that is we and the we that is I." What we do then has a sense of community about it, even if we're working on our own or in seeming opposition to something as part of a political group, for example. We do what we do, but we embody a caring nature that is neither self-effacing or domineering. We are truly helpful. Importantly, Schemmel's recovery also involved a spiritual aspect related to the 12-step recovery programs she attended. At the end of the day, the repression behind all repressions is the one involving our relationship to God. Our poor self-concept stems from a belief that He rejected us, that He regards us as unworthy. As we practice forgiveness towards those we hold responsible for our lopsidedness or defensive character armour, The blocks of shame and guilt that keep us fearful of God are removed, and we come to remember our true relationship with Him. And as we accept our sameness with each other, that we are all suffering from a belief in our unworthiness, yet also share the same holy self, we are released from the ego's tyranny of comparisons. This is why the Course's process of forgiveness can save us thousands of years, so to speak. Instead of going backward and forward between extremes until we recognise our wholeness, inherent connectedness and equality, a realisation that is the foundation of Hegel's synthesis, we can experience this in any given moment through connecting with our inner teacher and practicing forgiveness. Quote from the Course, "The miracle substitutes for learning that might have taken thousands of years. It does so by the underlying recognition of perfect equality of giver and receiver on which the miracle rests." End of quote. Because our ego identification is the ultimate source of our distress, we don't need to bring every grievance or every case of conflicting opposites within to light in order to let them all go. Quote, "It is not necessary to follow fear through all the circuitous routes by which it burrows underground and hides in darkness to emerge in forms quite different from what it is." End of quote. We don't have to look at absolutely everything that has been repressed. However, there will be one or two special people with whom we need to address our shame and guilt. Quote, "Should one brother dawn upon your sight as wholly worthy of forgiveness, then your concept of yourself is wholly changed. Your evil thoughts have been forgiven with his." End of quote. After working with specific issues in our lives, we will begin to accept the more general idea that our lack of peace comes from clinging to our special, separate ego identity, having turned our back on God's all-inclusive love and the inherent equality of oneness. Quote, "Yet it is necessary to examine each one as long as you would retain the principle that governs all of them. When you are willing to regard them not as separate, but as different manifestations of the same idea, the one you do not want, they go together." End of quote. The holy instant is the moment in which we choose forgiveness instead of shame and guilt, and identify with the wholeness of ourself. We can imagine what it would be like for the holy instant to be our only instant using a musical metaphor. In music, more than one voice or note can be heard and appreciated at the same time. This is called harmony. Recently, I listened to Under Your Spell from the musical episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The song starts with actor Amber Benson singing a sad, touching melody. Anthony Head then joins in the singing, and together the harmony creates a beautiful, vibrant depth. I can imagine this to be only a hint of what it's like when the holy instant is our only instant. As we sing in harmony with ourselves, each other and God's will, we experience the vitality of wholeness. And that is the end of the essay. And so the philosopher Hegel was obsessed with this idea of the end of history being a time when we experience freedom and equality and an appreciation for our interconnectedness. And he thought that would work itself out on the social plane out there in the world. Now, in A Course in Miracles terms, the resolution between conflicting opposites occurs by forgiveness, and it's something that occurs within your mind. The forgiveness process starts by withdrawing our projections of shame and guilt from somebody else and then asking for help from the Holy Spirit to address the shame and guilt that is within our own minds. And that will involve addressing some aspect of an extreme stance or tendency, and that extreme embodying some aspect of the shadows of the past and vengeance. And I'd like to finish with a little bit from Just Kids, written by Patti Smith. It's where she visits Robert, who is now dying of AIDS. She's older now, she's married, she has kids. Robert Mapplethorpe is very famous. He's got a lot of money, a large art collection. He's a very successful artist in his own right, got a lot of recognition as controversial as he was. But now he's dying of AIDS. and Patty goes to visit him. And this is just a short part from that passage in the book. There was no one present save his nurse, and she left us to ourselves. I stood by his bed and took his hand. We stayed like that for a long time, not saying anything. Suddenly he looked up and said, "Patty, did art get us?" I looked away, not really wanting to think about it. "I don't know, Robert. I don't know." And that's the passage. And it really, really struck me when I read this. It's such a beautiful book, but that question of Robert's, "Patty, did art get us?" really struck me. For me, it was a sign that Robert was feeling like art had got the better of them, had had a joke on them, or at least on Robert, like he'd been sucked in by art. And I think that reflects the specialness that was associated with his relationship to art. And it was a special love relationship because it was, in my interpretation, also a way of having vengeance on the past, on his father and his upbringing and what his father stood for, which was really the antithesis of this part that he was playing as the shy pornographer. Robert's true self, or truest self, may have created art that wasn't so confrontational, that's my theory, and self-deprecating, if it wasn't serving some kind of reactionary stance towards his father. And so his comment, "Patty, did art get us?" signifies to me that it had had a hold on him, as the ego does when we are in any special relationship or using a relationship for specialness needs. It then has a hold on us, as any addiction does, and we're not free. And I think that's what is being reflected in this section of Patty's book. Patty was very different in her approach to art. She's also very, very spiritual. And I'm not sure if she was brought up Catholic, but she's very Christian and open-minded towards other religions and spiritualities as well. And that spirituality, that spiritual core, in my eyes and from reading her memoir, is what kept her on a path that wasn't self-destructive in any way. Well, we have come to the end of this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this tour through art, music, history, A Course in Miracles, and the whole idea of opposites. Thank you very much for listening, and tune in again. Bye.